Well, welcome everybody to week 4. This is Dr. Waite. Hopefully, so far in the semester, things are going smoothly for you and you're enjoying the content. So far, some of you have reached out to me with some clarifications, and hopefully, I've been able to provide those thoroughly for you. As always, if there's anything in the notes or the assignments, or the quizzes that you're not sure about or want clarification, always feel free to reach out to me via email. We can also chat on the phone if that helps. Otherwise, we're moving on to the halfway point. So this week is the midterm point. So we're about halfway at the close of week 4. Some things to keep in mind for this week: we will be digging into chapter 12, which basically so far we've really focused on the upper extremities. Obviously, we went over the shoulder initially, and then we focused it on the wrist and elbow and the hand last week. So this week, by Sunday, make sure that you take your midterm exam. So that'll be the first official exam. So there's no quiz this week, just the midterm. And then you have your CAP 3 this week, which is a review on the upper quarter. So basically a review of what the joints we've looked at so far, primarily shoulder, elbow, looking a little at the spine and so forth as well, digging into some of that as we start to analyze exercises this week in the notes, okay? So getting right into the notes, we're digging into chapter 12, which is titled Muscular Analysis of Selected Exercises and Related Concepts. So feel free to download the PowerPoint. It's a pretty good sized PowerPoint this week. There's a lot of content. And again, the PowerPoint, you don't have to read it all word for word. It's mostly highlighting each section of the textbook chapter. So again, if you're better off, or if you prefer to read the textbook and go through it that way, that's fine. Or if you like the presentation version using the slides, that's great as well. And of course, following along with my video gives a little clarification and overview of what we're talking about. All right, so here we go. The first thing that the chapter is going to cover is just looking at the upper extremity activities. All right. So the focus is on the exercises, but first it gives a little introduction on what the emphasis and use for upper extremity activities are, anywhere from development at the elementary level up to through adulthood, looking at the primary areas of weakness. Those will be highlighted in the CAP 3 this week as well. So the first thing that we look at is the concept of strength and endurance in the shoulder area. That's the primary use for the upper quarter. Obviously, we use our shoulders quite a bit. What we use is to move our arms. It's the stability joint for both arms. So some highlights here: strength and endurance. The primary focus is on posture and functionality, and of course skilled performance movement as well. That's kind of a bonus. So we'll start off kind of looking at what are some of the weaknesses, impairments, things like shoulder impingements, like the labrum impingement and so forth, ways to overcome those, strengthen muscles and so forth. Okay. Part of the focus is on injury prevention as well. So as we get down into where it highlights a lot of the exercises, we're looking at not only strengthening muscles but also preventing injury just on day-to-day activities, as well as for those who pursue athletic endeavors. Okay. So one of the key things when we're looking at selecting exercises for the upper extremity is to make sure that we have muscular balance. Okay, so as you're moving through the PowerPoint and you get into exercises, it kind of highlights some of the focus for exercises, but then it gets into analysis, and when we're analyzing muscles, we're focusing on the function of the anterior and posterior muscles. So, think chest and back, right? The worst thing we could do is overtrain an anterior aspect and and neglect the posterior muscles, and that happens a lot. Oftentimes you'll see kind of a hunchback look, very typical of male athletes, male power athletes who use upper extremities a lot. We tend to have too much muscle and power in the anterior, so like the pecs and the biceps, but not enough strength in the triceps and the back muscles like the traps and the rhomboids. So it kind of gets this hunched look because we have tight muscles and larger muscles in the front rather than the back. So one of the key aspects when we're getting into this is thinking about functionality and having balance between and the agonist and antagonist muscle groups. Okay. All right. So getting right into some of the concepts for analysis. We're looking at how we group muscles together, looking at active tension, non-active tension, the use of muscle groups in opposition of each other, so bicep tricep function at the elbow, and then anterior posterior deltoid at the shoulder, as well as pec and trap and rhomboid use. Okay. One of the key things is when we're analyzing exercise, be able to identify what muscles are functioning, so which ones are creating the movement and also controlling the movement, as well as those would be the agonists, as well as the antagonist muscle groups that are basically passive but can be activated. And of course, then we can also look at isometric functions, which is utilizing both opposite muscle groups, so the agonist and antagonist become active for isometric. Okay, on slide 15, it gets into analysis of movement. The first movement that it breaks down is one of the most common, affecting the shoulder and elbow joints, which is a baseball pitch. All right, typical overhead throw. You could look at it for baseball, football, even goalkeepers like a soccer player, throwing the ball overhead. Even overhead rotation in like volleyball or tennis. So a lot of application here, similar movement, but breakdown of phases can differ depending on what skill we're looking at. The analysis that's provided in the slides, which is a great example, is just the traditional baseball pitch. It talks about a number of phases that can vary. This sport skill is broken down anywhere from 3 to 5 phases, which is pretty typical for most activities. So it's important to break down phases, understand what muscles are active during these different phases and how they become agonists and antagonists and so forth. And just learning how to be effective in the movement pattern. And also looking at, how we use these muscles, how we train them to better use them in activities, okay? So I'm going to skip ahead. You can look through the different phases that are broken down. We got the preparatory phase, movement phase, follow-through phase, recovery phase, and so forth, okay? So skill analysis number 1 is the baseball pitch. I'm going to kind of skip through that. So now I'm moving on to slide 29, which is looking at the kinetic chain concept. Now, this is a really important concept to understand. The kinetic chain refers to basically how the body is all connected and how movement in one area or one joint or even a muscle within activation of a joint, even though there could be multiple muscles, can affect other muscles down the chain. So your ability to move properly at the shoulder is going to affect the elbow, which is then going to affect the wrist and the hand in general. You'll see that in the CAP this week. There's some questions that refer to movement patterns that are incorrect in the upper extremity, hint, the push-up, and how movement at one joint can affect another joint down the line. Okay. So understanding the kinetic chain concept is really important, and it goes into the use of upper extremity all the way down to affecting the lower extremity. And later we'll get more into lower extremities in the weeks to come. But a great example of kinetic chain concept is, when you have weak glutes, it can affect your hip. When your hip gets tight, it can affect the IT band because the TFL is a part of the hip flexors. There's also extensors, which leads down the side of the leg, which then affects the knee. For runners, you get runner's knee. And then from the knee, it can go down to shin. You can get shin splints from it. You can get ankle problems. You can get pronation issues in the foot. Most issues in the ankle and lower leg is actually stemmed from the hip. So if it goes from hip to knee to ankle, I can attest to that. Running, multiple miles a day, it can wear on the body. And when I don't do the proper recovery and strength training during the week, I feel it in the weeks later because something gets weak and affects an area, and the kinetic chain goes into effect. Next thing you know, you're limping around on an ankle injury. So keep that in mind. Very important concept in dealing with functionality and primarily injury prevention. So the next concept, very important when we're looking at the application of exercise, is the conditioning considerations. Okay, you've probably heard these principles before, but the first one is the overload principle. Basically, what it's saying is that the only way to increase muscular strength is to overload the muscle so that it forces it to grow. So the overload principle is basically through training we add resistance, whether that can be manipulated through the FIT principle. So you've got frequency, intensity, time, and duration, or type of exercise. And you can manipulate any of those 4 variables to basically induce the overload principle to improve fitness of a muscle group or multiple muscle groups. Okay, so I'm going to skip through that principle. It does get into the concept of periodization, which again is involving that progressive training program to continue the overload. Talks about how you can get optimal gains out of strength training, and something to highlight that may not be specifically addressed in the slides, but I know it is in the textbook, is the idea of rest and also tapering. That can be important in long duration training programs. Okay, and that's part of the periodization principles. After you get through overload principle on slide 41. Slide 42 goes into the SAID principle, which stands for specific adaptations to impose demands. So we're looking at gradual increases over time, still kind of dealing with that periodization model. It gives some examples talking about an individual undergoing several weeks of training. How do we continue to improve joint range of motion, improve strength gains, and so forth. Okay, after the SAID principle, it gets into specificity, talking about targeting specific groups for the purpose of whatever desired outcome there is for the athlete or individual or the exerciser. After specificity, it gets into the concept of muscular development. Okay, that's starting on slide 52. So it talks about how do we gain muscle mass, kind of a breakdown of ensuring that we get adequate strength and endurance and flexibility while we're training, because all 3 of those concepts are important. It doesn't touch quite specifically on it really highlights muscular strength and endurance and then flexibility, but it doesn't really get into hypertrophy or power phases, because that's more of a sport specific adaptation. So the primary focus is how do we get the muscle stronger, how do we increase its endurance and therefore enhance posture over time, and then also flexibility, having range of motion at the joints due to flexibility in the muscles. Okay. So a few slides on muscular development. Also talks about the Valsalva maneuver, which is basically holding the breath during the down phase of the lift, so that you exhale during the up phase and get a better force output, basically enhancing the ability to lift properly and therefore lift more weight and therefore have greater gains in muscular strength over time. So kind of some interesting concept to look at on that. Then there's just a breakdown of exercises, and I'm not going to go through each one of these. I won't bore you with that. It's really a recap on what you've already gone over the last 2 weeks in looking at the muscles and which ones are active. And this one's kind of neat. So each exercise has like 3 or 4 slides on it. It breaks down the phases of the exercise. So the first one is an isometric exercise called the shoulder pull. And it talks about like what muscles are active, the agonists, antagonists, and then it gives you a breakdown of of the muscles in each joint and which ones are active in a table format. So pretty cool. It shows you the action of the agonists during those phases, and then it gets into the arm curl, which is your typical dumbbell curl action. Focusing mostly on the bicep anterior muscles, the biceps brachii, the brachioradialis, and the brachialis are the primary ones. So same thing. It breaks down. It gives you a table for the arm curl. Shows you the joint, the wrist, the hand, and the elbow. Flexions occurring in both. Shows you what muscles are active in the wrist as the agonists, and then the elbow flexors, which are the 3 that I just named. Okay. It shows you a down phase as well on the second slide. So moving through, we have the next one is triceps extension, really common exercise, barbell press, so pressing the weight overhead. So focus on the shoulder muscles, anterior muscles, and triceps. Then we have a bench press focusing on, again, the anterior deltoids, but also adding in the more of the pectoralis major. Shows you a breakdown of those muscles in tables. And then it gets into the pull-up, which would be an opposite muscle group, looking at the biceps and latissimus dorsi. It also shows you a lat pull-down, which is very similar to the pull-up or chin-up. Just emphasizing more on the lats because you have a wider grip and you're pulling the weight down rather than pulling your body to the bar. More of a modified exercise for the pull-up. Then it talks about the push-up. There's a fingertip push-up and a traditional push-up. And then there's the bent over dumbbell row, working on more of the back muscles. And then an abdominal curl, talks about that. Some prone extensions. Then he even talks about the squat. Now, we haven't gotten into the lower extremity much, so this is going to be new material for you, but it is good to pay attention to the squat and the deadlift exercises, as we will be addressing those more as we get into the lower extremity. So good introduction there. A couple other things is looking at abdominal contraction for the purpose of posture and engaging the trunk during exercises, and talks about rowing exercise, which obviously is working primarily the back muscles, but also getting the legs involved. It's kind of a total body exercise, which now becomes aerobic. Rowing is one of my favorite exercises because at least for doing it at the gym, because you're getting both kind of an aerobic and also anaerobic form of exercise, because you're really taxing the muscles, but also you're working aerobically, using oxygen to keep the muscles active over a long period of time, and using multiple muscle groups. I'd say it's up there with swimming as far as a total body workout. So there's some websites to visit. The first one's listed is one of my favorites from the ACSM, the American College of Sports Medicine. So be sure to check that out. And then right below that is probably my true favorite organization is the National Strength and Conditioning Association, or the NSCA. I have multiple certifications through the NSCA. It's a great organization. So for those of you that are looking to go into exercise physiology and more of the medical treatment route or sports medicine route, check out ACSM. That will be your primary go-to, like for physical therapists and so forth. Those of you that are going more of the strength training route, want to work as personal trainers, even PE coaching and so forth, look into the NSCA would be good. They're both great. Ultimately, in my opinion, you'll end up having to choose one organization over the other because they're expensive to be members of year-round. So you'll have to look into the pros and cons of what they offer you, articles and so forth, as a member. Great for student memberships as well, so be sure to check that out. I think the student membership for the NSCA is like $50 a year versus as a professional, I pay like $120 a year. The ACSM is like really dirt cheap. I don't even think they charge for students, but professional members are like 200 something a year, so they're the most expensive in the long run. But neat organizations to check out. So be sure to look at all the websites that are listed. There's a lot on here. Other ones that are really good are exerciseprescription.net, so exrx.net, and then the National Council of Strength and Fitness. They produce a lot of good stuff. Great place to get access to resources and references that'll be very, very helpful in multiple classes moving forward for you and in your profession. So, well, if you have any questions, feel free to reach out. That's about it for this week. Make sure you dig through the textbook, follow up on the concepts that you're not familiar with, and good luck on the midterm, and I'll see you in the discussions and so forth. Take care.